He sat at the table, pen trembling above the line that would erase generations of sacrifice. The banker's shadow loomed, ready to claim everything he had left. And then, it happened. His old chestnut horse let out a cry so fierce it toppled the table, scattering the contract like fallen leaves. That single moment dragged him toward a secret buried deep in the land, a truth no man had dared to touch. The day began before dawn, as it always had on the Ward farm, but this morning the silence was heavier than usual. Eli Ward rose from his bed long before the first line of sunlight touched the horizon. He dressed slowly, pulling on boots caked with years of dust, boots that once carried him through fields green with promise, now only through acres of barren soil. His joints ached, the kind of ache that didn't come from one day's work, but from decades of carrying burdens too heavy for one man alone. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee, but even that comfort had grown bitter. On the table, a stack of envelopes lay unopened, their official stamps shouting louder than any words. Overdue, final notice, foreclosure. Eli didn't need to read them anymore. He could feel the weight of debt pressing on his chest with every breath. He sat for a long while, staring out the window, mug cradled in his calloused hands, watching the fields as the dark gave way to gray. Beyond the glass stretched the land his father and grandfather had worked before him. Once it had been alive, rolling with rows of alfalfa, corn that reached toward the sky, and cattle grazing where the grass was thick. Now the earth had split, jagged cracks spreading like veins across the fields. Dust rose with every stir of wind, clinging to fences that leaned tiredly, boards weathered and broken. Where laughter and the sound of labor once filled the air, there was only the faint creak of wood and the low hum of cicadas. Copper stood near the barn, his chestnut coat dulled by dust, yet still catching glimmers of light where the sun touched. He was a strong horse, though his years showed in the gray flecks around his muzzle. Eli had raised him from a colt, taught him the rhythms of plowing, trusted him in storms, and leaned on him in the lonely hours when words failed. This morning Copper lifted his head, meeting Eli's eyes with a steady gaze that seemed almost too knowing. Mary came into the kitchen, tying her shawl around her shoulders. Lines of worry carved deep into her face, though she tried to hide them. She set bread on the table, her movements quiet, careful. "You didn't sleep again," she said softly. Eli shook his head, not trusting his voice. She looked at the envelopes, then at him. "The bank will come soon. You can't ignore it forever." Her words were not harsh, only tired. Eli reached for her hand, rough against rough, and gave it a squeeze. He had no answer that wouldn't wound them both. The first rays of light spilled over the valley, painting the dust in hues of gold that mocked its emptiness. Eli stepped out onto the porch, the screen door groaning on its hinges. He breathed in the dry air, the scent of earth and faint smoke from distant fires. The sky stretched wide, endless, and yet he felt trapped beneath it, like a man locked inside a cage made of horizons. Copper approached, hooves striking the packed ground with slow, measured steps. The horse nudged his shoulder gently, a quiet reminder that life still moved forward even when everything else seemed lost. Eli stroked his mane, fingers lingering in the coarse strands. "We'll keep going, old friend," he whispered, though even he didn't believe it. The low growl of an engine cut through the stillness. Eli stiffened. From the dirt road came a black truck, sleek and polished, a predator against the wounded land. Dust swirled in its wake, rising like smoke from a fire that refused to die. The truck slowed, then stopped near the gate. Dalton climbed out, tall, well-dressed, a smile too sharp to carry warmth. His boots were clean, his vest pressed, his hat tilted with practiced ease. He looked like a man untouched by hardship, a man who fed on the misfortune of others. Tucked beneath his arm was a folder, its edges neat, its weight heavy with promises disguised as mercy. "Morning, Ward," Dalton called, tipping his hat as if they were old friends. His voice carried the false ease of a man already certain of victory. "Thought I'd come by, see if we can't help each other out." Eli said nothing. His jaw tightened as he watched the man stride closer, every step deliberate, confident. Copper shifted, ears flicking back, as though sensing the unease that ran through Eli's veins. Dalton stopped at the foot of the porch, his eyes sweeping across the house, the fields, the barn, all with the hunger of a man sizing up prey. Then his gaze returned to Eli, sharp and unrelenting. He tapped the folder against his leg, smiling. "Times are hard," Dalton said smoothly. "No shame in admitting it, but I've got an offer that'll clear your debts, give you a chance to start fresh. All it takes is a signature." The words fell heavy in the morning air. Behind them, the land stretched wide and broken, and Eli felt the ground shift beneath him, not with hope, but with the weight of a choice he did not want to face. Eli sat alone in the barn long after Dalton's truck disappeared down the dusty road. The man's words still clung to him, heavy as chains. All it takes is a signature. He rubbed his palms against his thighs, roughened by years of rope and plow handles, and felt the sting of something deeper than debt. The farm was not just acres of dirt and timber. It was memory, a ledger written in sweat and sacrifice. To let it go would be to let his father vanish a second time. Copper shifted nearby, the soft sound of hooves against the wooden floor echoing in the stillness. The horse lowered his head, eyes calm but steady, as if he sensed the storm that churned inside Eli. Eli reached for the bridle hanging on the wall, his fingers brushing the worn leather. It had been his father's once, passed down the way land, and burdens were passed down in families like theirs. The barn smelled of old hay, leather, and dust, familiar, grounding. Eli closed his eyes, and the silence folded back into memory. He was a boy again, barefoot in the dirt, his father's shadow tall in the doorway. "Come here, son," his father had said, his voice steady as the land itself. "This horse will be yours one day. Treat him like family, and he'll never fail you." A young copper had snorted nervously then, his coat a brighter fire in the light of late afternoon. Eli remembered the rough feel of the reins in his small hands, the way his father's calloused palm had steadied him. His first ride was clumsy, more bouncing than balance, but the laughter of his father had filled the barn, rolling like thunder without storm. That was the summer his father took him to the northern pasture, where the old stone well stood. They had walked in silence, the kind of silence that carried more weight than words. The well was already cracked then, weeds growing thick around it. Eli had leaned over, peering into the darkness, tossing a pebble, and waiting for the sound of it striking bottom. It had taken so long he thought the stone had disappeared into another world. His father had crouched beside him, his hand resting on Eli's shoulder. "Remember this place," he had said. The land holds secrets. Sometimes it takes years for them to show themselves, but don't ever believe it's empty. The land is our blood. Eli's throat tightened as the memory slipped away. He opened his eyes to the dim barn, where Copper still stood watchful. He whispered the words aloud, though his voice cracked. The land is our blood. But what did blood matter against foreclosure notices and a man like Dalton? What did memory matter when Mary worried over bills, when his daughter June had stopped visiting because the farm felt like a place of ghosts instead of hope? The thought of June struck him hardest. He remembered her laughter as a child, running barefoot through green alfalfa, Copper chasing her like a gentle giant. She had grown up with the same dust on her clothes, the same sunburn on her cheeks. But unlike him, she had left. She had chosen a life away from this valley, far from the silence and the weight of land. And yet, he knew a part of her heart still beat here. That was why the idea of selling was more than surrender. It was betrayal. Eli rose and stepped outside. The sun had climbed higher, burning against the horizon, the heat pressing down like judgment. He walked past the sagging fences, each post a reminder of work unfinished. In the distance, he could see the ridgeline where he and his father had once hunted quail, where he had first learned to track the rhythm of seasons. Now even the birds were gone. Mary's voice called from the porch. Eli, come inside. It's too hot. He turned, meeting her eyes. She carried strength in her small frame, strength that had held them together through years of drought and disappointment. But her eyes betrayed exhaustion. She wanted relief. Any relief. Even if it meant signing Dalton's papers. Eli knew it, even if she hadn't spoken it aloud. He walked back slowly, Copper following, hooves stirring small clouds of dust. At the porch steps, Eli paused. He wanted to tell her about his father's words, about the promise he had felt as a boy. He wanted to tell her that the land was more than property, that it was memory stitched into the marrow of their bones. But the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he sat beside her and took her hand. The evening came quietly, the sun sinking behind the ridge, painting the sky in fire. Eli stood at the window long after Mary had gone to bed, staring at the fields. In the fading light, he imagined his father walking the rows, lantern in hand, checking the fences the way he used to. For a fleeting moment, Eli thought he saw that lantern glow near the northern pasture, a shimmer of memory, or perhaps something more. He whispered again, softer this time. The land is our blood. Copper's low wicker drifted from the barn, steady and grounding. Eli closed his eyes and let the sound carry him into uneasy sleep. The next morning, Eli lingered in the kitchen long after the sun had climbed. The air was already thick with heat, pressing through the screen door, carrying the smell of dust and faint smoke. Mary moved quietly behind him, pouring coffee, setting bread on the table, her silence heavier than words. The stack of envelopes still lay where he had left them, unopened. He pushed them aside with a rough hand, unwilling to see another threat written in ink. The sound of an engine broke the uneasy stillness. Tires crunched against the gravel drive. Eli's chest tightened before the vehicle even came into view. He didn't need to look to know who it was. Copper's sharp whinny carried from the barn, a sound edged with unease. Eli rose slowly, the wooden chair scraping against the floor. Dalton's black truck came to a stop just beyond the gate. Dust curled around it, sunlight glinting off the polished paint. Dalton climbed out, dressed sharp as always, his hat tilted, his boots clean. His smile came quick, but it was the kind that carried more hunger than warmth. "Morning, Ward," he called, walking toward the porch with the confidence of a man who believed the ground already belonged to him. In his hand was the same folder, the same weight Eli had seen before. Mary stiffened as Dalton tipped his hat in her direction. She turned and slipped into the house, leaving Eli alone on the porch. Dalton climbed the steps and placed the folder on the small table between them. He pulled out a chair and sat without waiting to be asked, brushing dust from his vest, as though the land itself dirtied him. "You've had time to think," Dalton said smoothly, tapping the folder with his finger. "This is the simplest way forward. Sign, and you're free. The bank will be satisfied, your debts cleared. You and your wife can start again someplace new. No shame in letting go, Ward. Times like these, a man has to be practical." Eli didn't move. His hands rested on his knees, fists clenched, eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the fields. Practical. That was the word men like Dalton used when they wanted to strip a man of his past. Practical meant forgetting the sweat of his father, the laughter of his daughter, the pride in every fence post and furrow. Dalton leaned in, lowering his voice. "You hold out much longer, and the bank won't give you choices. They'll take what they want, and you'll be left with nothing. Better to go with dignity, don't you think?" Copper's hooves struck the ground outside, the sound sharp, like a warning. Eli glanced toward the barn and found the horse staring at him, ears pinned back, eyes fixed on Dalton. A strange calm washed over him. He had always trusted that gaze, trusted the silent language between them. Dalton slid the papers free, unfolding them neatly across the table. The legal words sprawled across the page, cold and final. He pulled a pen from his pocket and placed it carefully on the line where Eli's name belonged. "Just one stroke," Dalton murmured, his smile widening. "One stroke, and the weight lifts. You'll sleep again." Eli's hand trembled as he reached for the pen. His throat felt tight, his breath shallow. The image of his father rose before him, standing tall at the edge of the northern pasture, lantern light flickering across his face, saying, "The land is our blood." Mary's face flashed next, weary but strong, her eyes silently begging him to find a way forward. And then June, a little girl laughing as Copper chased her through tall grass, her voice high and bright. The pen touched paper, scratching a faint mark just above the line. Dalton leaned closer, eyes gleaming. Then Copper let out a piercing cry, louder than Eli had ever heard. The sound ripped through the air, fierce and commanding. The horse reared against the fence, hooves striking wood with a crack. The table shuddered beneath the force of the sound, and the papers fluttered. The pen slipped from Eli's grip, leaving only a smudge where his name was meant to be. Dalton flinched, his smile breaking into a snarl. "Control that animal," he barked. But Eli couldn't move. His gaze locked on Copper, who pawed the earth with wild urgency, nostrils flaring, eyes blazing with something that was not fear, but insistence. For a moment, Eli felt as though the horse carried the voice of his father, his grandfather, every Ward who had ever laid hand to soil here. Dalton shoved the papers back toward him, anger flashing in his eyes. "Don't let a beast make your choices, Ward. You've got one chance. Take it, or you'll regret it." Eli stared at the contract, then at the horse, then at Dalton. His chest rose and fell, the war inside him raging. He wanted the burden gone, wanted the silence of debt lifted, but Copper's cry still echoed in his ears, a sound that refused to let him surrender. Dalton pushed the pen across the table again. Do it. Eli's hand hovered above the page. But before it could fall, Copper slammed his hooves against the fence with a thunder that shook the yard. Dust rose in a cloud, swirling through the porch. The contract lifted in the wind, pages scattering to the ground like leaves torn from a tree. Dalton cursed, lunging for them, but Eli stood slowly, his chair scraping back. He didn't reach for the papers. He didn't move to help. He only stood, staring at the horse whose eyes burned with truth, and felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, Eli's chest filled with something other than despair. He didn't yet know what it was, defiance, perhaps, or the faint spark of hope. But it was enough to keep him from signing. Dalton gathered the pages with quick, angry motions, stuffing them back into the folder. His jaw was tight, his smile gone. You'll regret this, Ward, he spat, slamming the folder shut. I'll make sure of it. Eli said nothing. He looked once more at Copper, who stood tall and unyielding, and knew the horse had spoken louder than Dalton ever could. The air around the porch still vibrated from Copper's cry, as though the sound had carved itself into the very boards of the house. Eli stood frozen, the smudge of ink on the contract like a stain of hesitation, while Dalton's curses filled the yard. The papers lay scattered, some caught against the porch steps, others swept further into the dust. Dalton stooped to grab them, snapping them back into his folder with jerking motions, his jaw tight with fury. Mary had come to the doorway at the sound of Copper's cry, her hand pressed against her chest. She looked first at Eli, then at the horse, then at Dalton, her eyes wide with a fear that wasn't just about the contract anymore. Copper still pawed the ground, nostrils flaring, muscles tense, as though daring Dalton to take another step closer. You'll regret this, Dalton spat, slamming the folder against his thigh. His practiced smile was gone now, stripped down to bare anger. No animal's going to save you from the bank. You think you've won something, but all you've done is dig your grave deeper. He turned sharply, boots crunching on the gravel, and stalked back toward his truck. The engine roared to life, sending another cloud of dust into the air as he tore down the road, leaving behind only the echo of his threat. The silence that followed was heavier than the roar of the engine. Eli's chest rose and fell, each breath ragged. He looked down at his hands, still trembling, and then at Copper, who stood at the fence, his gaze steady, his body braced like a soldier holding ground. Mary stepped onto the porch, her voice hushed, but sharp. Eli, what just happened? He shook his head slowly, unable to form the words. His eyes stayed fixed on the horse. There had been something in that cry, something more than instinct, more than fear. It had been a command, a plea, a warning all at once. Eli felt it in his bones, the way he had once felt his father's hand steadying his own. Copper snorted, shaking his mane, and then, as though the moment had passed, turned and began walking toward the far side of the yard. But he didn't move aimlessly. His steps were quick, deliberate, pulling him in a straight line as if guided by something Eli couldn't see. Eli's stomach tightened. He stepped down from the porch, ignoring Mary's call behind him, and followed. Copper, he muttered, half a question, half a prayer. The horse didn't slow. He moved past the barn, past the corral, toward the thinning grass near the northern pasture. Eli hurried to keep up, his boots kicking dust, his breath ragged from more than exertion. The land there was wilder, less tended, overgrown with weeds that had clawed their way through years of neglect. Copper stopped suddenly at a patch where the ground dipped slightly, near a cluster of stones half buried by time. He pawed at the earth, head tossing, eyes burning with urgency. Eli stopped short, chest heaving, staring at the place. A memory stirred. His father's lantern glow, the words spoken by the old well. "No," Eli whispered, his throat tight. "That can't be it." But Copper pawed harder, striking sparks of dust into the air. He whinnied again, a lower sound this time, insistent and raw. Eli dropped to his knees, pressing his hand to the ground. The stones were cold beneath his palm, the weeds brittle. He scraped them away, his fingers trembling, and found the edge of weathered stone. His breath caught. Behind him, Mary's footsteps crunched in the dirt. "Eli, what are you doing?" Her voice wavered between fear and disbelief. He didn't look up. "He wants me to see," Eli muttered, half to himself, half to her. "He's been trying to tell me." Mary stood frozen, watching as Eli tore away more weeds, revealing the rough circle of an old stone well, its edges cracked and worn by years. She shook her head. "That's nothing but ruins. It's been dry longer than you've been alive." But Eli wasn't listening. His chest surged with something he hadn't felt in years. An energy. A sense of direction. He pressed his ear against the stone, straining for sound, though there was nothing but silence. Still, Copper stood beside him, eyes bright, body tense, as though guarding the secret. Mary stepped closer, her voice pleading now. "Eli, don't do this to yourself. Dalton's right about one thing. You can't fight what's coming. Digging at old stones won't change what's written." On paper, Eli lifted his head slowly, dust clinging to his face. His eyes were wild, desperate, yet certain. "Paper doesn't hold this land together. Blood does. Memory does. And he pointed at Copper, he knows it." Copper snorted as if in answer, stamping once more against the earth. Mary wrapped her arms around herself, torn between fear and the faint spark of something in Eli's eyes she hadn't seen in years. She turned back toward the house, unable to watch, but unable to walk away completely. Eli stayed kneeling by the stones long into the evening, the last light painting the land in long shadows. Copper never moved far, circling, watching, waiting. The well stood silent, but Eli's heart pounded with the certainty that something had shifted. Dalton's threats echoed in his ears, but for the first time, they didn't feel final. The cry that had shattered the silence still lived inside him, and it had pulled him to this place. Whether it was madness or miracle, he didn't yet know. But he could no longer deny it. The night passed in restless fragments. Eli lay awake on his bed, staring at the ceiling, the faint creak of wood blending with the echo of Copper's cry. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the horse's gaze, unyielding, filled with something that bordered on human insistence. That look had dragged him from the porch, pulled him across the yard, and set him down before the old stones of the forgotten well. He couldn't shake it, couldn't dismiss it as mere instinct. By dawn, the air was already warm, carrying the smell of dust. Eli rose before Mary stirred, pulling on his boots with a weight that wasn't entirely exhaustion. He stepped out into the yard, the horizon faintly streaked with pink. Copper stood waiting near the fence, ears pricked, eyes fixed on him, as though he had been standing guard all night. Eli walked toward him slowly, a strange unease pressing against his ribs. When he reached the horse, Copper nudged his chest firmly, then turned his head toward the northern pasture. The same path as yesterday. Eli exhaled, his breath catching in a half-laugh, half-sigh. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" he murmured. Copper stamped his hoof once, then began walking. Eli followed. The land crackled beneath his boots, weeds crunching underfoot. But Copper moved with purpose, weaving through the patches of scrub as though he knew exactly where to go. They reached the cluster of stones again, the mouth of the old well, half buried under tangled weeds. Eli crouched, brushing away more of the overgrowth. His fingers scraped against rough stone, and he felt the circle more clearly now, each rock weathered but still locked in place. He leaned over the edge, staring down into darkness. The air rising from the gap was cool, carrying a faint scent of earth that seemed older than memory itself. His heart pounded. He whispered, almost afraid of his own voice. "Why here, Copper?" "What do? You want me to see?" The horse lowered his head beside Eli, snorting softly, his breath stirring the dust. His eyes were fixed, sharp, demanding. Eli met that gaze, and for a long moment it felt as though the world narrowed to just the two of them. The man and the horse, the question and the answer. Memories stirred again. He saw himself as a boy, standing at this very place with his father's hand on his shoulder. He heard the steady voice. "The land holds secrets. Don't ever believe it's empty." Eli sat back, rubbing a hand across his face. His throat tightened, his chest heavy. "If there's something here," he whispered, "then show me." Copper pawed at the ground beside the stones, striking sparks of dust, his ears twitching as though he heard something Eli could not. The horse's persistence chipped away at the walls of Eli's doubt. He pushed harder at the stones, loosening clumps of soil. One rock shifted, tumbling into the blackness below. The hollow echo stretched long before fading. Mary's voice carried from behind. "Eli?" He turned. She was standing a few paces back, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Her eyes flicked from him to Copper to the crumbling well. Fear and weariness mingled in her expression. "You're chasing ghosts," she said softly. "That place hasn't given water in my lifetime." "Your father never fixed it because he knew it was gone." "Why dig up what's dead?" Eli rose slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. "Because he told me to remember," he said. His voice shook, but conviction threaded through it. He knew something. And Copper, he knows too. You saw him yesterday. He pulled me here. Mary's lips pressed into a thin line. "A horse doesn't know secrets, Eli. He just knows you. He feels your fear, your anger, your hope." Don't put words in his eyes, but Eli shook his head. He stepped closer to Copper, resting a hand against his warm neck. "These eyes don't lie. He's showing me something, Mary. I can't explain it, but I can't ignore it either." Mary turned away, arms tight across her chest. "Dalton will be back. You can't fight him with stones and memories." Her words cut deep, but Eli didn't argue. Instead, he lowered himself to the ground again, scraping at the soil, loosening more rocks. His fingernails filled with dirt, his back ached. But he pressed on. Copper stood close, shifting from hoof to hoof, every movement filled with urgency. At last, Eli's hand struck something different. Not stone, but wood, rough, splintered, buried deep. His pulse surged. He clawed away more soil until the edge of a weathered plank emerged. It was the rim of a cover, sunken and hidden beneath years of neglect. He froze, his breath catching. Mary stepped forward, drawn despite herself. Her eyes widened, disbelief warring with recognition. "That's," she whispered. "That's a cover." "But how?" Eli didn't answer. His hands worked faster, clearing dirt, revealing more of the wooden surface. His heart thundered in his chest. The well wasn't just a ruin. It had been sealed. Someone, his father, maybe his grandfather, had hidden it, not abandoned it. He looked up at Copper. The horse's eyes gleamed in the morning light, steady and certain. Eli whispered hoarsely, "You knew. You brought me here." Copper blew out a sharp breath, nudging him with his head, as if urging him to finish what he had started. Mary stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. She didn't speak again, but in her silence was something new. Not belief, not yet, but the beginning of it. Eli pressed his hand flat against the wood, feeling its rough strength. For the first time in years, hope stirred in his chest, not a spark born of desperation, but a flame lit by faith. And it had come from the eyes of a horse that could not lie. The cover of weathered wood stared back at Eli like a secret the land had been keeping all these years. His fingers traced the edges, feeling the grooves carved by time and the weight of soil. He sat back on his heels, breathless, as if the discovery itself had stolen the air from his lungs. Copper stood still, head lowered, eyes steady, a silent sentinel at his side. Mary lingered behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around her body. She shook her head slowly. "Eli, what if it's nothing? What if you're digging up a memory that never meant what you think it did?" Eli didn't answer. He was too deep inside himself now, the whisper of his father's voice echoing with every heartbeat. "Remember this place." His hands trembled as he dug away more soil, clearing the wooden surface until its full circle was revealed. The cover was old, cracked, but still held firm, as though someone had placed it there with intent. Mary stepped closer despite herself, crouching beside him. "Your father never told me about this," she murmured. "He didn't tell me either," Eli admitted, his voice rough. "But he showed me the well, and he told me to remember. Maybe this is why together they cleared the last of the dirt." Eli pressed against the cover, but it held fast. He leaned his weight into it, wood creaking under the strain, until finally it shifted with a groan that seemed to rise from the earth itself. A rush of cool air escaped, smelling of stone and damp earth, so out of place in the choking dryness around them. Eli sat back, stunned. He looked at Mary, whose eyes widened with the same disbelief that rattled his own chest. "There's something down there," he whispered. Copper snorted, stamping the ground once, as if to affirm it. Mary's voice shook. "Eli, what if it's dangerous? What if it collapses?" But Eli shook his head, lowering himself toward the dark opening. He lowered a lantern they had brought, its glow flickering weakly against the stone walls as it descended. The rope strained, the flame bobbing, until it lit upon the bottom, a space not filled with water, but with something solid. Eli's pulse quickened. "There's a chest," he said hoarsely. Mary gasped. "A chest? You can't mean—" But Eli was already moving, tying off the rope to a nearby post. His hands were clumsy, his breath uneven, but determination carried him. He lowered himself carefully, the lantern swinging above his head, the smell of damp stone growing stronger with every foot. His boots struck solid ground at last, dust swirling around him. The chest was there, tucked against the wall, its wood dark with age, iron hinges rusted but intact. Eli's hands shook as he touched it, the grain rough beneath his fingers. 1,000 thoughts rushed through him. His father's secrets, the years of silence, the debt pressing down on him, Dalton's smirk. He whispered into the shadows, "What did you leave me, Pa?" With effort, he dragged the chest toward the rope. Mary leaned over the opening above, her face pale in the lantern light. "Eli, be careful!" He tied the chest, steadying it as Mary hauled slowly with all the strength she had. The rope groaned, fibers straining, but Copper stepped forward, gripping it in his teeth. With a heave, horse and woman together lifted the chest from the darkness. Eli climbed out after, his chest burning, his arms trembling from the effort. They laid the chest on the ground, the three of them, man, woman, horse, circling it like witnesses to something sacred. Eli knelt, brushing away the last clumps of dirt. The lock was old, rusted nearly through. With one hard strike of a stone, it gave way, snapping open. Mary covered her mouth as Eli lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth, were bundles of papers, edges yellowed with time. He pulled one free, hands unsteady, and unrolled it. His breath caught. "Deeds," he whispered. "Titles. Rights to the land." Mary knelt beside him, eyes scanning the faded ink. This proves your family owned not just the farm, but the water beneath it." Eli swallowed hard, pulling another paper free. At the bottom of the stack was a folded envelope, brittle with age. He broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was his father's. "Son, if you have found this, it means the land has tested you. It will break you down, make you question everything, even your own blood. But the land remembers. It carries more than crops. It carries our name, our fight, our hope. If you ever believe there is nothing left, come here. What you hold now is proof that the land is not lost. But more than that, it is proof that you are not alone. Trust it. Trust the ones who walk beside you. Even the beast knows when man forgets." Eli's vision blurred. The words wavered, but he held them tight, as though letting go would sever the last bond to his father. Tears fell onto the page, staining it darker. Mary placed her hand on his shoulder, silent, her own eyes wet. Copper lowered his head, resting his muzzle against Eli's arm. The weight of it was grounding, steady, warm. Eli turned his face into the coarse hair, sobbing quietly into the creature that had led him here. For a long while, none of them moved. The chest lay open, the letter spread, the papers glowing faintly in the lantern light. The world outside seemed to hold its breath, as though the land itself bore witness. Eli lifted his head at last, wiping his face with the back of his hand. His voice broke, but it carried with a strength he hadn't felt in years. "We're not finished." Not yet, Copper whickered softly, and Mary, though still trembling, nodded. The path forward was uncertain, filled with threats and burdens. But in this moment, by the mouth of the old well, they had unearthed more than deeds or letters. They had unearthed the strength to keep fighting. Eli sat on the ground, his knees in the dirt, the open chest between him and Mary. The papers inside fluttered in the faint breeze, their edges brittle, their ink faded but not gone. His father's handwriting seemed alive on the letter, the strokes bold and deliberate, as if the man had known these words would be needed someday. Eli read them again under his breath, his lips trembling. The land remembers. Trust the ones who walk beside you. Even the beast knows when man forgets. Mary leaned closer, her hand gripping his arm. Eli, these papers, they could change everything. Eli nodded slowly, though his mind spun. He had lived so long under the shadow of loss that hope felt foreign, dangerous. And yet here it was, solid in his hands. Proof that the Ward land carried more than debt. It carried rights, history, and perhaps salvation. Copper pawed at the ground nearby. Restless, his ears pricked as if listening to voices only he could hear. Eli reached to stroke his neck, grounding himself in the horse's presence. But before he could speak again, the sound of an engine shattered the fragile stillness. Both Eli and Mary turned sharply. The black truck rolled up the drive, dust billowing behind it. Dalton stepped out, moving faster this time, his smile gone, his jaw set hard. Mary's hand tightened on Eli's arm. "He's back," she whispered. Eli rose slowly, the letter still clutched in his hand. Dalton's eyes darted from the chest to the papers, narrowing as he approached. "Well, well," Dalton said, his voice sharp as barbed wire. "Looks like you've been playing archaeologist." "What's this? Family treasure? Don't tell me you think a box of old papers is going to save you." Eli's heart pounded, but he held his ground. "These papers prove this land is mine." "More than mine. It's my family's. My father left them for me." Dalton barked a laugh, though his eyes gleamed with unease. "Do you really think the bank cares about your daddy's bedtime stories? Ink on paper won't pay what you owe. And if those papers were worth anything, why were they buried in the dirt instead of locked in a safe?" Mary stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Because they were meant to be found when the time was right." Dalton shot her a look of disdain, then turned back to Eli. "Give them here." He reached out, hand snapping toward the documents. Before Eli could react, Copper lunged forward, teeth bared, slamming his head against Dalton's chest with a force that sent him stumbling back. Dalton cursed, clutching his side, his face contorting with rage. "You keep that beast away from me!" he snarled. Eli's voice came steady, low, stronger than he felt. "You stay away from this land. You stay away from my family. You've got no claim here." Dalton straightened, brushing dust from his vest, his expression darkening. "You think this changes anything?" "The bank doesn't care about your horse or your father's ghost stories. They'll come knocking, and when they do, I'll be there to collect what's left." He jabbed a finger toward Eli, his voice dropping to a hiss. "Don't test me, Ward. You'll lose more than dirt if you do." Eli tightened his grip on the letter, his knuckles white. "I'd rather lose everything than sign my name to your lies." For a moment, silence hung heavy between them, broken only by Copper's low snort, hot breath steaming in the cooling air. Dalton's eyes flicked to the horse, then back to Eli, a shadow of calculation crossing his face. Without another word, he turned sharply, storming back to his truck. The engine roared, and the vehicle tore down the road, leaving a trail of dust like smoke from a fuse. Mary let out a shaky breath, her shoulders trembling. She looked at Eli, her eyes wide. "He's not going to stop." "You saw his face." Eli nodded, his jaw clenched. "I know. But neither am I." He looked down at the letter again, tracing his father's handwriting with a finger. The words burned into him, into the marrow of his bones. "The land remembers. Trust the ones who walk beside you. Even the beast knows." Copper pressed his head against Eli's shoulder, the weight of it solid and certain. Eli leaned into the horse, his free hand gripping the coarse mane. "We're not finished," he whispered again, this time with conviction. Mary knelt by the chest, her hands brushing over the documents, her eyes wet but bright. "Then we fight. For the land, for your father, for us." Eli lifted his gaze to the horizon, where the last light of evening painted the fields in fading gold. Dalton's threats echoed in his ears, but so did his father's words, and the strength in Copper's gaze. For the first time in years, Eli felt the stirrings of defiance rise within him, not the brittle kind born of desperation, but the steady fire of a man standing where his blood told him to stand. The chest lay open, its secrets bared, but it was not just a box of paper. It was a covenant between past and present, between man and land, sealed by the eyes of a horse who refused to let him forget. The days after Dalton's outburst carried a strange tension, as though the very air was waiting for something to break. Eli moved through his chores with sharper ears and quicker eyes, aware of every sound beyond the fences. The chest and its contents were hidden safely in the loft, wrapped again in the oilcloth. But Eli felt the weight of it pressing against his thoughts. Proof. His father's words, his father's trust, all bound in those fragile pages. And Dalton knew they existed. That was enough to keep Eli awake at night. Copper paced more often now, circling the fence lines, ears flicking toward the road whenever an engine sounded in the distance. His muscles tensed at shadows, and Eli began to realize the horse was no longer just a companion, but a watchman, restless and vigilant. Mary noticed it too. One evening, as she prepared supper, she set down her knife and turned toward Eli with weary eyes. "He's unsettled. Copper. He doesn't rest the way he used to. He's warning us," Eli said simply. Mary frowned, shaking her head. "Or maybe he's feeding on your fear." "Eli, you've been different since that chest. More desperate, more haunted," Eli wanted to argue, but the truth was tangled in her words. He did feel haunted, by his father's voice, by Dalton's threats, by the fragile hope that flickered whenever he touched the papers. Hope was a dangerous thing. It could lift you higher than you dared, only to break you harder when it failed. That night, as Eli doused the lantern in the barn, he heard it. The crunch of tires on gravel, slow and deliberate. He stiffened, hand gripping the pitchfork like a weapon. The lights of a truck cut across the far field before shutting off. The silence that followed was worse than the engine's growl. Copper snorted, pawing the ground. His body tensed, nostrils flaring as he stared into the darkness. Eli stepped closer, his own breath quickening. He couldn't see anyone, but the feeling of eyes on him was undeniable. "Dalton," he muttered. The shadow withdrew, tires grinding softly as the truck rolled away. Eli stood in the barn doorway long after the sound faded, his hands clammy, his chest tight. They weren't alone anymore. By the next morning, the signs were clearer. A section of the fence had been knocked down, the posts splintered, as though something heavy had driven through deliberately. 2 of the younger calves had wandered out, though Copper had corralled them back before dawn. Eli found fresh boot prints in the dirt near the northern pasture. Mary's face went pale when he showed her. "He's trying to scare us." Eli nodded grimly. "Or worse. He wants me rattled, wants me to feel like this land isn't safe anymore, wants me to break before he has to lift a hand." Mary's eyes glistened. "Then what do we do?" Eli looked past her toward Copper, who stood steady, watching them both. The horse's ears twitched at every sound, his chestnut coat catching the morning light. "We stand." That's what we do. But standing came with its own costs. 2 nights later, Eli woke to Copper's frantic whinny, sharp and urgent. He grabbed his boots, rushing outside to find the horse rearing against the fence, eyes blazing, hooves striking sparks from the wood. Beyond the fence, shadows moved. 2 men, dressed dark, scattering as Copper lunged. They bolted toward a truck parked on the road, laughing as they jumped in, the engine roaring to life. Eli's blood boiled. He chased after them, but Copper was faster. The horse cleared the fence with a furious leap, pounding down the dirt road, his cry ripping through the night. The truck fishtailed, gravel spraying, and sped away into the dark. Copper slowed only when the taillights disappeared, then returned to Eli, sides heaving, eyes still alight with fury. Mary stood on the porch, her shawl pulled tight, her face stricken. "They'll come again," she whispered. "Yes," Eli said, running a hand down Copper's neck. "And so will we." The following days turned into a grim routine. Eli repaired fences by daylight, eyes scanning the ridgeline for dust trails. Copper paced tirelessly, refusing to rest, as if every hour demanded vigilance. Mary moved with caution, her shoulders tight, as though expecting Dalton himself to step through the door. One evening, Hank, the old neighbor, came by with a lantern in hand. His gait was slow, but his eyes were sharp. "Heard noises the other night," Hank said, lowering himself onto the porch step with a grunt. "Not coyotes, not boys playing pranks." That was trouble. Eli nodded, jaw tight. "Dalton's sending his shadows." Hank spat into the dirt, shaking his head. "That man's got no shame. He'll push till you break, but your daddy—" He paused, his eyes narrowing with memory. "Your daddy never broke." "Neither should you," Mary's voice cracked. "But what if it costs us more than land?" Hank looked at her gently, then at Eli. "That's the thing about standing. It always costs, but it's the only way you keep what's worth having." The night stretched long after Hank left, the lantern light fading into darkness. Eli stood beside Copper in the barn, his hand resting against the horse's warm flank. Dalton's shadows would come again. He could feel it in the weight of the air, in the restless tension that gripped the farm. But as Copper lowered his head against Eli's shoulder, breathing steady and strong, Eli whispered into the silence, "Let him come. We'll be ready." The moon hung high over the valley, pale and watchful, casting silver light across the wounded fields. Eli walked alone toward the northern pasture, the chestnut shadow of Copper trailing silently behind him. In his hands he carried the letter his father had left, folded carefully, edges worn from his constant touch. Tonight, he felt the weight of it heavier than ever. Not because of Dalton, not even because of the debt, but because of the choice it demanded of him. The old well stood waiting, a ring of stone like a scar in the earth. Eli crouched at its edge, brushing away the dust that had already begun to settle over the boards they had shifted days earlier. He lowered the lantern close, the flame flickering, shadows stretching down into the black throat of the well. He thought he heard the echo of his father's voice in that darkness, steady and firm as always. "The land is our blood." He laid the letter flat on the stone rim, smoothing it with trembling hands. "Pa," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know if I've got the strength to do this. Mary's scared. June's gone. Dalton's got his claws everywhere. But I can't." His throat tightened. He bowed his head, words trembling through him. "I can't let go." "Not yet," Copper stepped forward, nudging him gently, the horse's breath warm against his cheek. Eli looked up into those unblinking eyes and felt something shift inside, and he had lived most of his life trying to hold on to land because it was duty. But now, standing here, he realized it was more than duty. It was covenant. The horse knew it, the earth knew it, and somewhere deep inside so did he. He pressed his palm flat against the stone, then drew a slow breath. "I swear before this land, before the blood of my father and his father, before him, I will not give it up. I will fight, no matter what it costs. If it takes me down, then I'll fall standing here." The words carried into the night, swallowed by the silence. But Eli felt them root in his chest like seeds planted deep. For the first time, his fear settled into something harder: resolve. The sound of tires on gravel shattered the moment. Eli stiffened, rising to his feet. Headlights cut across the field, growing brighter, bearing down fast. Copper's muscles tensed, ears pinned, his body shifting protectively between Eli and the approaching truck. Dalton's black vehicle screeched to a halt, throwing up dust. He climbed out, his figure sharp against the glare of his headlights. Two men followed, broad-shouldered, faces shadowed beneath their hats. Dalton's smile was thin, wolfish. "Ward," he called, his voice carrying across the pasture. "Couldn't sleep?" "Neither could I. Thought I'd check on you, see how that little chest of yours is doing." Eli didn't move. "You've got no claim here." Dalton chuckled darkly. "Maybe not on paper. But I've got ways of making things mine, and paper doesn't stop men like me." He stepped closer, his boots crunching the dry earth. "You think the sheriff's going to save you? Think some old ink and your daddy's bedtime stories are going to keep the bank from taking this place?" "You're clinging to ghosts," Ward Copper whinnied sharply, the sound cutting through Dalton's words. The horse's body loomed larger in the headlight beams, his shadow stretching across Eli like a shield. Dalton flinched, but quickly masked it with a sneer. Eli's voice was low, steady. "This land is mine. My father's. My family's. I swore it tonight, and I'll swear it again. You can bring your papers, your men, your threats, but you'll never take it." Dalton's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. He tilted his head toward the two men, who shifted, stepping forward. Eli's heart pounded, but he didn't back away. Copper pawed the ground, nostrils flaring, a sound like thunder building in his chest. Dalton raised a hand, halting his men. He studied Eli for a long moment, then spat into the dust. "You're a stubborn fool. You'll starve clinging to this dirt, and when you do, I'll be waiting. And I won't just take the land, I'll take the last shred of pride you've got left." He turned sharply, signaling his men back. They climbed into the truck, the engine rumbling to life. Dalton paused once more, his gaze fixed on Eli. "Think hard, Ward. Men who make oaths in the dark usually end up buried in it." The truck roared off, red taillights shrinking into the distance. The night closed in again. the silence thick. Eli let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Copper pressed close, his flank solid against Eli's side, steadying him. Eli picked up the letter, holding it tight against his chest. He whispered into the night, not for Dalton, not even for his father, but for himself. This land is not alone. And neither am I. The words felt like iron in his mouth, forged by fire. He had made his oath. There would be no turning back now. The morning after Dalton's threat broke over the farm like a storm that never quite left. Eli rose before the sun, though he had barely slept. Every creak of the house, every stir of the wind outside had sounded like footsteps in the night. He went to the barn in silence, Copper meeting him with a steady gaze, the horse's warm breath misting in the cool dawn. The weight of the oath Eli had sworn still pressed against his chest, not as a burden, but as a binding. He would not yield. By mid-morning, dust rose along the road again. For one tense heartbeat, Eli thought Dalton had returned. But when the truck came into view, it wasn't Dalton's black beast. It was a sheriff's cruiser, its white paint dulled with dust, red and blue lights quiet. Sheriff Tom Hollis stepped out, adjusting his hat against the sun. Eli's stomach clenched. Mary came to the porch, her face pale. The sheriff's presence never meant peace, only reckoning. "Morning, Ward," Tom called, his voice even, steady, the kind of tone a man used when he wanted to show calm where none existed. "Mind if I come up?" Eli nodded stiffly. "What brings you out here?" Tom climbed the steps, his boots striking wood with deliberate rhythm. "Dalton came to see me. Said you're holding on to land that's not yours to keep. Claims you've been stirring trouble," Mary let out a sharp breath. "He's lying." Tom held up a hand gently. "That's what I'm here to figure out." He studied Eli's face, then glanced toward the barn, as if sensing that the real heart of the matter lay there. Eli took a slow breath, then motioned for Tom to follow. They walked to the loft, where Eli pulled down the chest, setting it carefully on a bale of hay. Tom's eyes narrowed, lines deepening across his brow as Eli unfolded the deeds and the letter. "These were my father's," Eli said, voice firm but low. "He left them hidden by the old well. I found them only days ago. They prove the land's mine, prove the water rights are too." Tom bent over the papers, his eyes scanning the faded ink. He rubbed a thumb over the seal on one of the deeds, then glanced at the letter. Silence hung heavy as he read, the dust motes swirling in the lantern light. Finally, he straightened, his gaze fixed on Eli. "They look real," Tom said slowly. "Old, but real. Thing is, proving it in court takes more than paper in a chest." Eli bristled. "And what does Dalton have?" "Empty threats? Bought men? You've known my family all your life, Sheriff. You know this land is ours?" Tom's eyes softened, but his voice stayed cautious. "I knew your father, yes. Knew he'd sooner break than bend. And I see the same fire in you. But Dalton's got money, connections, ways of twisting the law till it sings his tune. That's the fight you're staring down, Eli." Before Eli could answer, a voice rasped from the doorway. "He ain't wrong. But he ain't the whole truth either." They turned. Hank, the old neighbor, leaned on his cane, his lantern swinging at his side, though daylight flooded the barn. His eyes, sharp beneath bushy brows, fixed on the chest. "I saw your daddy bury that," Hank said. His voice cracked with age but carried conviction. "Was just a boy myself, but I never forgot." He said, One day, my son'll need this more than he needs air. Eli's throat tightened. And you never spoke of it? Hank shrugged. Wasn't my place. He made me promise to keep it until the time came. Looks like that time's now. Tom studied Hank for a long moment, then nodded. That's witness testimony. Carries weight, especially from a man who's got nothing to gain. Hank grunted. Only thing I got left to gain is seeing a good man keep what's his. Mary stepped forward, her eyes wet but burning. So what happens now? Dalton won't stop. He'll keep sending his men, keep twisting the truth. What do we do, Sheriff? Tom replaced his hat, his gaze steady. What you do is hold firm. What I do is watch. Dalton steps outside the law. I'll be there. But make no mistake, he'll push till the breaking point. You've got to decide if you can outlast him. Eli met Tom's eyes, then looked at Hank, then at Copper, who had stepped closer, head lowered, eyes fixed on the sheriff, as though weighing him too. We can outlast him, Eli said finally, his voice carrying a strength that silenced the barn. Tom studied him a moment longer, then gave a short nod. Then I'll be back. And when Dalton makes his next move, and he will, you'll have more than ghosts standing with you. He turned and left, his cruiser kicking up dust down the road. Hank lingered, setting his lantern down beside the chest. Your daddy was right about this land, he said softly. It ain't just dirt. It remembers. And so do I. Eli gripped his father's letter in one hand and Copper's mane in the other. For the first time, he felt that his fight wasn't just his anymore. The witnesses had arrived, and with them, a new strength. The days that followed Sheriff Tom's visit stretched long and heavy, yet different. For the first time in years, Eli felt something stronger than dread tugging at him. Hank's words, the sheriff's reluctant respect, the presence of Copper steady as a rock, all of it wove together into a fragile rope of hope. But hope demanded proof, and Eli knew where to find it. The old well had been cleared of weeds and stones, its wooden cover pried back, and the chest lifted from its hiding place. Yet Eli couldn't look at the dark mouth without feeling his father's voice stirring inside him. The land remembers. He had repeated those words like a prayer, but now they needed more than faith. They needed water. One hot afternoon, Eli shouldered a spade and carried it to the pasture. Mary followed, her eyes clouded with doubt, but her steps steady. Hank came limping behind with his cane, muttering about how a man his age had no business digging holes, though his lantern swung at his side all the same. Copper trailed them, ears forward, as if sensing the weight of the moment. The three of them stood around the well, the sun beating down, the air shimmering with heat. Eli took off his hat, wiped sweat from his brow, and drove the spade into the earth. The sound rang sharp, metal striking stone and packed soil. Hour after hour they dug, clearing rocks, deepening the shaft, lowering buckets of debris by rope. Eli's back ached, his palms blistered, but he pressed on. Mary wiped dirt from her cheeks with the edge of her shawl. Hank grumbled, but never stopped hauling rope. Copper watched from above, pacing the rim, letting out sharp cries whenever Eli paused too long. As the sun sank, Eli struck deeper into the shaft, his spade clanging against something softer than stone. He froze, the sound ringing in his ears. He jabbed again. This time, mud clung to the blade. His chest tightened. He clawed at the wall with his hands, pulling away damp soil. Moisture glistened on his fingertips. "Mary," he called up, his voice cracking. "Hank, the ground's wet." The rope creaked as Mary leaned over the rim, eyes wide. "Are you sure?" "Feel it yourself," Eli laughed, half sobbing. He pressed his hand harder, and a trickle seeped through the cracks, darkening the dirt. The scent of cool earth rose up, rich and alive, a smell he hadn't breathed in years. With frantic hands, he dug faster. A sudden gush broke through, a thin stream at first, then a stronger flow, spilling into the bottom of the shaft. Eli stumbled back, his lantern light shimmering off the sheen of water pooling around his boots. "It's here," he whispered. His throat tightened, tears cutting through the grime on his face. "By God, it's here!" Above, Copper reared, letting out a triumphant cry that echoed across the valley. The sound rang like a herald, fierce and wild, carrying far beyond the pasture. Mary clutched Hank's arm, her own tears falling freely. The old man's eyes shone wet, though his smile was crooked and proud. They worked quickly, shoring up the shaft, lowering buckets to lift the first water. When Eli hauled it up, the bucket heavy and sloshing, he set it down in the dirt. Mary dipped her hands into it, gasping at the coolness, pressing it to her lips. She passed it to Hank, who sipped slowly, reverently. Finally, Eli lifted it to Copper's mouth. The horse drank deep, shaking his head, droplets sparkling in the fading light. Eli dropped to his knees beside the bucket, scooping water into his hands and letting it pour over his face. The dust, the years of drought, the fear, all of it seemed to wash away with that one simple act. He pressed his forehead against Copper's muzzle, sobbing openly, not caring who saw. The sun dipped low, painting the horizon in red and gold, but the well glowed with its own light, the reflection of the lanterns shimmering across the surface below. It was as though the land itself had opened its heart, giving back what had been hidden. They stood together in silence, drinking in the sight until the growl of an engine broke the moment. Dust rose on the road. Dalton's truck pulled up, headlights cutting through the twilight. He climbed out slowly, his expression unreadable. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice carrying mockery. "Looks like you've struck yourself a puddle." "Congratulations. Shame it won't pay a dime of what you owe." Mary stepped closer to Eli, her hands clenched. Hank leaned heavy on his cane, but stood tall. Copper lowered his head, ears pinned, muscles rippling under his coat. Eli rose, the bucket at his feet, water dripping into the thirsty earth. He met Dalton's sneer with a gaze steady as stone. "This water is proof. Proof the land isn't dead. Proof it still remembers," Dalton laughed, though it rang hollow. "Proof? That's mud in a hole, Ward. You'll find out soon enough that mud doesn't keep a roof over your head. And when you do, I'll be waiting." He turned sharply, climbing back into his truck. The engine roared, taillights fading into the dusk. But Eli didn't watch him go. He stood by the well, Copper pressed close, Mary and Hank at his side. His father's words echoed in his chest. The land had spoken, not with ink, not with memory, but with water. And it had chosen not to let go. The morning after the water broke free from the well, Eli rose to a sound he hadn't heard in years. The trickle of water flowing, seeping into buckets, dampening the thirsty earth. The sun crept over the horizon, lighting the valley in soft gold, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, the land didn't look like a graveyard. It looked alive. Copper grazed nearby, pausing every so often to lift his head toward Eli, ears flicking, eyes bright. The horse's whole stance had changed, less weary, less burdened, as though the discovery of water had lifted more than soil. It had lifted despair itself. Mary stood by the porch, her shawl loose about her shoulders, watching her husband with an expression that mingled exhaustion and something close to wonder. Word spread quickly. By midday, neighbors began to arrive, drawn by whispers that the Ward farm had water again. Hank was the first, hobbling with his cane, pride in his eyes. Behind him came the Johnson boys with their father, then Clara from the next county with her husband. They crowded around the well, eyes wide, dipping ladles into the bucket, sipping as though tasting a miracle. "This'll change everything," Clara murmured, her hand on Mary's. "If the Ward land has water again, the valley's not lost." Eli stood among them, overwhelmed. He had fought so long alone that the sight of others sharing in his hope felt unreal. He caught Mary's gaze across the crowd, and she smiled, her lips trembling as though she too was remembering what it felt like to stand with others. But not everyone came with joy. As the sun lowered, Dalton's truck appeared once more, a black scar across the horizon. He didn't bring men this time, only himself, but his smirk carried the same poison. He parked at the edge of the yard, stepping out slow, as if savoring the moment. "Well," he drawled, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Looks like you've got yourselves a puddle." "Congratulations." His eyes flicked toward Eli, then to the well. "But let me remind you all, water or no water, the bank owns the deed. And I'll be the one holding the pen when it comes time to settle." The crowd stiffened. Hank jabbed his cane into the dirt. "You're wrong, Dalton." I saw Eli's daddy bury that chest. I swore it, and I'll swear it again. This land belongs to the Ward's Sheriff Tom's cruiser pulled up behind Dalton's truck, dust swirling. He stepped out, his eyes steady, voice calm but edged with steel. "I've seen the papers, too." "I've heard the testimony. You've had your say, Dalton. Now let the law do its work." Dalton's face darkened, but he didn't push further, not with so many eyes on him, not with the sheriff watching. He sneered, muttering under his breath, then climbed back into his truck and roared away. Silence hung in his wake, broken only by the sound of Copper's steady breathing. Eli reached for the horse, his hand settling on the strong neck, feeling the thrum of life beneath the skin. "This land will stand," Eli said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Not because of papers, not because of banks. Because it remembers. Because we remember." The words sank into the silence, met with nods, murmurs of agreement. Mary stepped beside him, slipping her hand into his, her grip strong. Hank raised his lantern, the light catching on every weathered face, every hopeful eye. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the valley, but Eli no longer felt the weight of darkness pressing in. The oath he had sworn was no longer his alone. The water, the witnesses, the strength of a horse who had never abandoned him, all of it stood with him now. Eli pressed his forehead against Copper's muzzle, closing his eyes. "We're not alone anymore," he whispered. The horse snorted softly, warm breath against Eli's skin, as though answering, "We never were." And for the first time in a lifetime, Eli believed it. And so, the farmer stood by the well, no longer alone, his horse by his side, his land alive again. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Just drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments so I know you're here with us. Don't forget to subscribe, because many more stories of courage, loyalty, and the bond between people and animals are waiting for you in the next videos.